Ha! Told you I'd see you in part two, and here we are. So we're talking about cellular respiration for these parts. So what's happening here in general, this is a process that releases energy by breaking down glucose, sometimes other food molecules in the presence of oxygen. This is an aerobic process. That's a term we used in the first video. Aerobic meaning oxygen. So oxygen is present and is used up to make this happen. And here's the equation. Something looks kind of interesting. If you look closely at that equation, hopefully it looks vaguely familiar in some way because, oops, sorry, thought I had it here. This is the exact opposite of the photosynthesis equation. So it's the same thing. All the pieces are the same. All the numbers are the same. It's just in the other order. So cellular respiration, the overall thing that's happening is the same process, but instead of using energy to build food molecule or a glucose molecule, we are using oxygen to break down a food molecule to produce energy. So this is what happens when your cells are breaking down food to use energy. And of course, this happens in the mitochondrion. A lot of people will tell you the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, but they have no idea what that means. This part of the notes, this is what that means. So next time someone tells you that, you can be more specific and explain to them what they're actually talking about. So yes, mitochondria are where this is taking place. Oh man, last time we only had 2 steps for photosynthesis. Now we got 3. Dang it. So the 3 steps of cellular respiration are glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. But if you want to be like one of the cool kids, you can call it ETC. All right, so there is a mitochondrion. So notice it's more than just a blob. It has 2 membranes. The darker color here is the outside membrane. And then the inside membrane has all these little folds and squiggles inside. So if you've seen diagrams of mitochondria before, all the squiggles that you see is actually a second membrane inside the first one. Let's look at each step. So this is step 1, glycolysis. What's happening is glucose, that's our sugar that we started with, C6H12O6, is broken down to make pyruvic acid. Another name for that is pyruvate, and a little bit of ATP. So these are some details about things that are happening. You don't have to know the minor specifics there, but you need to know the overall pattern that's happening. So we start with glucose, sugar. That's our food molecule. We are going to break it down to give us pyruvic acid or pyruvate, and we get a little bit of ATP. Remember, ATP is like the battery of the cell. That's what we want. That's the whole process, or the whole point of the process, because we can use that to do anything that the cell needs to use energy. Okay, so this is kind of like you got to spend money to make money. Same thing with glycolysis. You have to spend a little bit of ATP to get it started, but you get a little bit more as a result. You can see that in the diagram here. So we actually spent 2 ATP. We got 4 ATP. So in breaking that glucose down into 2 pyruvates, we got a net gain of 2 ATP, which is a net gain, but it's really not that much. It's not enough to power the cell for too long. So to get all the energy we can out of the glucose that we started with, we got to break it down again. For this first step, oxygen does not have to be present. So that's an important thing when we get to fermentation in a few minutes. So step 2, what's going to happen here? Pyruvate or pyruvic acid is what we ended the first step with. We're going to break it down again, and that is going to give us a little bit more ATP and also some more energy carriers. Those are like the things we saw in photosynthesis that store chemical energy and take it from one place to another. And if you remember the overall picture, we started with glucose, which has 6 carbons. We broke it into pyruvic acid, which is 3 and 3. When we get to step 2, we're going to take our pyruvic acid, our 3s, and we're going to break it down even more. When you break it down, you get carbon dioxide. So you'll saw in the equation, carbon dioxide is one of the products or one of the waste materials we get. That comes from step 2, the Krebs cycle. That's where our CO2 is released in this process. So this is also happening in the mitochondria. Here is a detailed diagram of the Krebs cycle. If you take biology, like a higher level bio class someday, you might have to know that. We're not going to be that detailed, thankfully. So we do get a little bit of ATP from the Krebs cycle, but still it's not very much. It's not a lot. It's not enough to power the cell for a really long time. For this step, oxygen does have to be present, unlike glycolysis. But the energy carriers we get from step 2, from the Krebs cycle, are going to be used in step 3, and that's really what it's all about. Step 3, electron transport chain, or ETC, this is where most of the energy comes from. Again, some detailed diagrams here that you don't need to know all the details of these for this class, but the overall pattern that's happening is, so far, we started with glucose, we broke it down to pyruvic acid, we broke that down to carbon dioxide. In the process, we got a little bit of ATP, which is nice. We're going to keep that. But we got a lot of energy carriers, things like NADH and FADH2. Just you need to know those are energy carriers. They're like kind of like batteries that we charged up. Now, in step 3, we're going to use those energy carriers to do something, and specifically all of these arrows and funny things and double membranes and all that. Long story short, we're going to use the energy of the energy carriers to make ATP. That's what this big, awesome protein over here does, ATP synthase, which is another detail that you might not need to know. So, summary, energy carriers are used to make ATP. This happens kind of between the membranes of the mitochondria. So this is the inner membrane. This is the space between the two membranes. Here's the outside membrane. So it's happening across that inner membrane. And this is important because this is where we get most of the energy from the whole process. We get a little from step 1, little from step 2. Step 3, ETC is what it's all about. All right, here's a zoomed out diagram showing you the whole process together. Step 1 is glycolysis. Glucose gets broken down to pyruvate. This step is anaerobic, so oxygen does not need to be present, and it's happening in the cytoplasm outside the mitochondria. What do we get? Well, we get a little bit of ATP, but not much. We get some energy carriers. We're going to use those later on. And we get pyruvate. So ATP, great. The cell can use that right away. Energy carriers, we're going to send those to ETC. We'll use those later for step 3. Pyruvate, those are our 3 carbons. So sets of 3 carbon that we got from breaking down glucose. We send those to the Krebs cycle. Now we are in the mitochondria. You need oxygen for this to happen. Pyruvate is broken down. This step is where your carbon dioxide is produced as a waste product. What does this step give us? So a little bit of CO2 as a waste gives us a small amount of ATP. So the cell is ready to use that. But this also gives us a bunch of energy carriers. So step 3, notice the only thing that we're inputting into step 3 is all of these energy carriers that we got from step 1 and from step 2. So by putting those energy carriers into step 3, we can use all those proteins and ATP synthase to make a lot of ATP. That's the whole point. So step 3 is where we use the energy carriers to make most of the ATP that we get from the process. Okay, so as a summary, you'll notice that photosynthesis and cellular respiration have the same pieces. They just go in opposite directions. So both of them have glucose, Both of them have oxygen. Both of them have CO2. Both of them have water, H2O. In cellular respiration, you're breaking down glucose with oxygen to give you carbon dioxide as a waste and water and a lot of energy. In photosynthesis, you start with carbon dioxide and water. You use light energy to build a glucose molecule, and then you get some oxygen as a waste. So those two things kind of make a cycle together. This is one of the reasons why we have this nice balance, because things that are doing photosynthesis are constantly producing oxygen, which helps things that are doing respiration because they're constantly using oxygen, and it's sort of this cycle going around and around, which is good for us because we appreciate oxygen and things like that. It's part of this bigger thing called the carbon cycle, about how carbon can be shuffled among these different organisms because all of the foods you're eating are carbon based, and we're all breathing, so we're breathing out carbon dioxide, we're taking in carbon in our food, and it's constantly cycling around these different things. Okay, there's another Amoeba Sisters about cellular respiration. I strongly encourage you to watch it, maybe watch it tomorrow, so you'll have a day to let this stuff kind of settle. Everything will make a whole lot more sense if you watch this video as well. Okay, lastly, we're going to talk about some kind of exceptions types things to what we've been going through in the notes so far. So bacteria, what do they do? Remember, bacteria are prokaryotes. They don't have a nucleus. They don't have organelles, which means they don't have mitochondria. They do something that is similar to cellular respiration. We're not going to talk about all the details, but instead of using the membrane on the mitochondria to do that, they use their own cytoplasm, their own cell membrane. So it's a similar process, but we don't need to know the details of it today. Most bacteria are going to be aerobic if they're doing that process, so they need oxygen to make it happen. There are some exceptions. One of the exceptions is something called fermentation. So this is probably the most important video. If you only watch one of the Amoeba Sisters videos, watch this one on fermentation. But I'll give you some general ideas about it now. So with aerobic respiration, that's what we just talked about. So that's like the whole process of cellular respiration, breaking down food with oxygen. That is performed by most cells most of the time. The reason that we use oxygen and we need oxygen is because that lets you break down food enough to release large amounts of ATP. To do that, you have glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and ETC. There's another way to kind of partially break down foods without using oxygen. That is anaerobic respiration. So anaerobic means without oxygen, and that's the same thing as fermentation. So this is a way to still break food down, but no oxygen is required. So that's a benefit, but the downside is you don't get nearly as much ATP when you do this. Some cells do this all the time. So these are some prokaryotes that don't need oxygen at all. They're doing anaerobic respiration. Some cells do it temporarily if oxygen is scarce. So that happens in human cells. You might have heard of like anaerobic workouts or something. Those are when you are like pushing your muscles to their maximum. So when you're sprinting, you're using energy so quickly that you don't have enough oxygen. So your cells are still breaking down glucose to power the cells. But if they run out of oxygen, they go into fermentation. They're breaking things down without oxygen. So you can use it as like an emergency high use situation, but you're not getting as much ATP, so you can't do it over a longer time scale. So what's happening here? It's basically everything we talked about except cut it off after glycolysis, because step 2 and step 3 do need oxygen. But now we're just talking about step 1, glycolysis, breaking down glucose into 2 pyruvates or pyruvic acids You don't need oxygen to do that, so your cells can keep doing that even when they don't have enough oxygen. Because we don't send that pyruvic acid onto the Krebs cycle, we're not able to break it down further, but it gets converted into lactic acid. So that's one of the reasons that you might feel sore after you're working out or sore after you're sprinting, is because if you push yourself to do anaerobic working out, or you're pushing your cells into fermentation, you're not able to fully break down those pyruvates, so they build up as lactic acid. Here's a summary of fermentation. A couple things I want to point out. So everything in blue is the full anaerobic respiration. So this is the full process of cellular respiration, where you go through glycolysis, you break it down to pyruvic acid, you get a little bit of ATP. If you have oxygen, you can do the Krebs cycle. Oxidative phosphorylation is just a fancy name for ETC. That's step 3. So if you have oxygen, you do step 1, 2, and 3. You get a lot of ATP. If there's no oxygen, that pushes you into fermentation. So you can still break glucose into pyruvic acid. You get 2 ATP, not as many as the 36 we get down here. But no oxygen means you have to stop there. You can't do Krebs. You can't do ETC. And the pyruvic acid kind of hangs around, and you have to do something with it. In humans, we break it down and push it down into lactic acid. So pyruvic acid goes to lactic acid. Our muscles get sore. In other organisms, particularly yeast, they do a lot of fermentation, but that pyruvic acid gets broken down into ethanol, which is alcohol. So when yeast is used in like wine making, that's where the alcohol actually comes from. It's anaerobic respiration. So they're sealed in this environment. They use up all the oxygen, and they produce ethanol as a result. And that's why the term fermentation is what they use to describe the process of making lots of different alcoholic beverages. Okay, that idea of fermentation may be new, so I strongly encourage you to watch the Amoeba Sisters video on fermentation. If these notes are confusing at all, please let me know if you have questions. I think the reviews we're going to do this week will help kind of put the pieces together. It's a lot of information, but I wanted to make sure you had it all together in one place. So thanks for watching, and I will be in touch with you. Hope to hear from you soon or see you soon. And until next time, thank you. I appreciate your work.